The biting wind whipped across the manicured lawns of Oakhaven Academy, a prestigious boarding school nestled in the heart of New England. Inside, the grand hall buzzed with the excited chatter of graduating seniors dressed in crisp blazers and designer dresses, their futures seemingly preordained paths of success and privilege. But in a quiet corner, tucked away near a towering bookshelf, stood Elias Thorne, a scholarship student, his worn suit a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Elias wasn't like the others. He hadn't grown up in sprawling estates or spent summers yachting in the Mediterranean. His world was a small, cramped apartment above his mother's struggling bakery in a working-class neighborhood miles away. Oakhaven had been his golden ticket, a chance to escape the limitations of his background, a promise whispered in acceptance letters and scholarship agreements. But the reality had been far harsher than he anticipated. He had excelled academically, his sharp mind absorbing knowledge with an almost desperate hunger. He consistently topped his classes, outperforming the legacy students who seemed to float through their studies on a cushion of inherited wealth. Yet, his accomplishments were often met with thinly veiled condescension, dismissive remarks about his humble origins, and a constant feeling of being an outsider looking in. The upcoming graduation ceremony was a stark reminder of this divide. While his classmates spoke excitedly of Ivy League acceptances and lucrative internships, Elias faced a daunting uncertainty. He had applied to numerous universities, hoping for financial aid, but the responses had been lukewarm at best. The weight of his mother's sacrifices, her tireless efforts to support him, pressed heavily on his shoulders. He overheard snippets of conversations, whispers about summer homes in the Hamptons, extravagant graduation gifts, and the inevitability of success. One particular group, led by the arrogant and influential Charles Beaumont III, son of a prominent senator, caught his attention. Charles, with his perfectly coiffed hair and dismissive smirk, was the epitome of Oakhaven's elite. He often made veiled jabs at Elias's background, his words dripping with a subtle yet unmistakable disdain. "Did you hear Thorne actually applied to Harvard?" Charles said, his voice laced with amusement. "Imagine him trying to fit in at a place like that. Probably thinks the dining hall is a five-star restaurant." His cronies erupted in laughter, a sound that grated on Elias's nerves. He tried to ignore them, focusing on the worn pages of his book, but the sting of their words lingered. He had always believed that hard work and merit would be enough to overcome his circumstances, but Oakhaven had taught him a different lesson. It was a place where privilege reigned supreme, where birthright mattered more than brilliance. As the days dwindled down to graduation, a sense of despair began to creep into Elias's heart. He felt trapped, caught between the world he desperately wanted and the one he seemed destined to remain in. But beneath the surface of his quiet demeanor, a flicker of defiance began to ignite. He refused to be defined by their prejudices, to let their arrogance extinguish his dreams. He would find a way, even if it meant facing the world alone. He just didn't know how. Not yet, but he would. Resumo temático. Uma pessoa humilde, menosprezada e injustiçada em um ambiente elitista enfrenta a situação com dignidade até que uma reviravolta expõe a hipocrisia e o preconceito, resultando em justiça e na responsabilização dos culpados. The graduation banquet loomed, a gaudy spectacle of forced smiles and hollow congratulations. Elias found himself seated at a table near the back, far from the Beaumonts and their ilk. He picked at the elaborate meal, the lobster and filet mignon tasting like ash in his mouth. He noticed Mrs. Hawthorne, the school librarian, watching him with a knowing, sympathetic gaze. She had always been kind, slipping him extra books and offering quiet encouragement. Later, as the headmaster droned on about Oakhaven's legacy and the bright futures of its graduates, Elias excused himself and slipped outside. The cool night air offered a momentary respite from the suffocating atmosphere. He walked towards the old oak tree that stood sentinel at the edge of the campus, a place where he often sought solace. He was startled by a voice. Couldn't stomach another minute of it either, huh? It was Sarah Chen, another scholarship student, though one who, unlike Elias, seemed to navigate the social minefield with a quiet confidence. She was brilliant in mathematics and possessed a dry wit that often caught the privileged off guard. "It's a lot," Elias admitted, gesturing vaguely towards the brightly lit hall. Sarah leaned against the tree, her expression thoughtful. "Charles and his cronies are unbearable tonight. I overheard them talking about Operation Thorne Downfall. Apparently they've been actively trying to sabotage your university applications." Elias felt a cold dread wash over him. He had suspected something, but to hear it confirmed was devastating. Sabotage? How? Letters of recommendation mostly, subtle things, suggesting you lack leadership potential or social graces, enough to raise doubts, especially when competing against candidates with family connections. The breath caught in Elias's throat. This was beyond mere snobbery. It was a calculated attempt to destroy his future. But on why? Sarah shrugged. Because you're a threat. You consistently outperform them, and they can't stand it. They need to maintain their position at the top, and that means keeping people like us down. Rage simmered beneath Elias's quiet exterior. He had worked tirelessly, sacrificing everything, only to have his dreams deliberately crushed by entitled bullies. Sarah straightened up. I can't prove anything directly, but I have a friend in the admissions office at Princeton. He mentioned seeing some unusually lukewarm recommendations for you, all originating from Oakhaven faculty. He thought it was odd given your stellar academic record. She paused, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small USB drive. I also managed to borrow some files from the school's server. Nothing concrete, but there might be something in there that could help. Elias stared at the USB drive, a tiny piece of plastic that held the potential to expose the deep-seated corruption of Oakhaven. He felt a surge of determination, a refusal to be silenced. This wasn't just about his future anymore. It was about challenging the system that allowed privilege to trump merit. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you. Really, thank you. He knew that using the information would be risky, but he couldn't let Charles and his cronies get away with their actions. He would fight back, not with anger or resentment, but with the truth. He would expose their hypocrisy and their blatant disregard for fairness. The underdog for once would have his day. He clutched the USB drive in his hand, a small weapon against a powerful enemy. The fight had just begun. Resumo temático. Uma pessoa humilde, menosprezada e injustiçada em ambiente elitista, enfrenta a situação com dignidade, até que uma reviravolta expõe a hipocrisia e o preconceito, resultando em justiça e na responsabilização dos culpados. Back in his Spartan dorm room, Elias plugged the USB drive into his ancient laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying a labyrinth of files and folders. He navigated through the school's administrative network, Sarah's digital breadcrumbs leading him deeper and deeper, hours blurred into a tense, silent vigil. He bypassed firewalls and decrypted encrypted files, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a newfound urgency. He found it, buried deep within a folder labeled Disciplinary Actions, Confidential, Emails. Lengthy, damning exchanges between Charles, his father's office, and several Oakhaven faculty members. The emails detailed a coordinated effort to undermine Elias's applications, fabricating incidents of misconduct and subtly altering his letters of recommendation. The evidence was irrefutable. One email from Charles himself was particularly chilling. "He doesn't belong here," it read. "He's taking a spot that should rightfully belong to someone who understands the value of Oakhaven. Make sure he doesn't get any ideas about leaving his station." Elias stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The casual cruelty of the words, the blatant disregard for his dreams, fueled a burning anger. He saved every email, every document, every piece of evidence. He knew he had to be careful. Exposing this would be a David and Goliath battle, and he needed to be prepared for the fallout. The next morning, at breakfast, Charles approached him, a smug look on his face. "So, Thorne," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Heard anything from Harvard yet? Tough competition, I imagine." Elias met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Not yet, Charles, but I'm hopeful." Charles chuckled. "Hopeful? You're delusional. Face it, Thorne. You're not one of us. You never will be." He leaned closer, his voice a low hiss. "You're nothing but a charity case, a footnote in Oakhaven's history. Don't get any ideas about rising above your station." Elias remained silent, his fists clenched beneath the table. He wouldn't give Charles the satisfaction of seeing him break. He would bide his time, gather his strength, and then he would strike. Later that day, during the graduation rehearsal, the headmaster announced a change in the program. "We are pleased to announce that Mr. Elias Thorne has been selected to deliver a brief address to the graduating class," he said, his voice booming through the auditorium. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Charles's face turned crimson with rage. He shot Elias a venomous look, his eyes promising retribution. Elias walked to the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his opportunity. He looked out at the sea of faces, the privileged elite of Oakhaven, their futures seemingly assured. He saw Mrs. Hawthorne in the audience, her eyes filled with encouragement. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "Good morning," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I want to talk to you today about Oakhaven, about what it means to be a part of this institution, about the values it claims to uphold." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But more importantly, I want to talk about the truth." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the USB drive. The room fell silent. "This," he said, holding it up for all to see, "contains evidence of a conspiracy, a deliberate attempt to undermine my future, orchestrated by some of the very people who claim to represent the best of Oakhaven." A murmur of disbelief swept through the audience. Charles jumped to his feet, his face contorted with fury. "He's lying," he shouted. "This is slander." Elias ignored him. He continued, his voice gaining strength. "These emails, these documents, reveal a pattern of deceit and manipulation, a blatant disregard for fairness and justice. They expose the hypocrisy that lies beneath the polished surface of Oakhaven." He looked directly at Charles, his gaze unwavering. "The truth will come out," he said, "and those who have abused their power will be held accountable." Resumo temático. Uma pessoa humilde, menosprezada e injustiçada em um ambiente elitista enfrenta a situação com dignidade, até que uma reviravolta expõe a hipocrisia e o preconceito, resultando em justiça e na responsabilização dos culpados. The headmaster, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, stammered, "Mr. Thorne, I must insist, this is highly inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" Elias echoed, his voice rising with indignation. "What's inappropriate is the systematic abuse of power that's been happening right under your nose. What's inappropriate is destroying someone's future simply because they don't come from the right background." He clicked a button on his laptop, projecting one of Charles's most damning emails onto the large screen behind him. The room gasped. Even some of Charles's staunch supporters looked away, shamefaced. Charles, beside himself with rage, lunged towards Elias. "You little—" But Sarah stepped in front of him, her eyes blazing. "Touch him, Charles, and you'll regret it." Her quiet confidence belied a steely resolve that even Charles seemed to recognize. He hesitated, then backed down, muttering threats under his breath. The headmaster, regaining some semblance of composure, addressed the crowd. "This is a serious accusation. We will need to investigate these claims thoroughly." "Investigate?" Elias scoffed. "You've been complicit in this from the beginning. You've turned a blind eye to the elitism and prejudice that permeate this school." He turned back to the audience. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to look at the evidence, to question the values that Oakhaven claims to represent. Are we truly a meritocracy, or are we just perpetuating a system of privilege and inequality?" A wave of unease washed over the room. Some students began to murmur amongst themselves, their faces etched with doubt. Others remained silent, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Then, a single voice rose above the din. "He's right." It was Emily Carter, a legacy student whose family had donated millions to Oakhaven. She stood up, her voice trembling but firm. "I've seen it too. The way scholarship students are treated, the subtle biases, the unspoken assumptions. It's not right." More voices followed, hesitant at first, then growing in strength. Students who had previously remained silent, afraid to challenge the status quo, now found the courage to speak out. They shared their own experiences of prejudice and discrimination, their stories painting a damning portrait of Oakhaven's hidden underbelly. Even Mrs. Hawthorne, the librarian, stood up, her eyes filled with tears. "I've worked at Oakhaven for over 30 years, she said, her voice choked with emotion. "And I've seen this happen time and time again. Bright, talented students being held back because they don't fit the mold. It's a tragedy." The tide had turned. The carefully constructed facade of Oakhaven was crumbling before their eyes. Charles stood alone, isolated and exposed, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. His father's influence, his family's wealth, meant nothing in the face of the collective outrage. The headmaster, realizing the gravity of the situation, announced that the graduation ceremony would be postponed indefinitely. He promised a full and transparent investigation, assuring everyone that those responsible would be held accountable. As the auditorium emptied, Elias felt a sense of exhaustion wash over him. He had risked everything, but he had finally spoken the truth. He had exposed the hypocrisy and prejudice that had plagued Oakhaven for so long. Sarah approached him, her eyes filled with admiration. "You did it, Elias," she said, her voice soft. "You actually did it." Elias smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "We did it," he corrected. "We did it together." He knew that the fight was far from over. There would be repercussions, challenges, and obstacles to overcome, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope. He had found his voice, and he would use it to fight for a better, more just world. A week later, the results of the investigation were released. Charles Beaumont III, along with several faculty members, were expelled or dismissed from Oakhaven. Charles's father, the senator, faced a barrage of public criticism and calls for his resignation. Elias received acceptance letters from several prestigious universities, including Harvard, all with full financial aid packages. The letters praised his academic achievements, his resilience, and his unwavering commitment to justice. He stood outside Oakhaven one last time, looking up at the old oak tree that had been his sanctuary. He had come to Oakhaven as an outsider, a charity case, a footnote, but he was leaving as a champion, a symbol of hope for those who had been marginalized and oppressed. He was no longer defined by his circumstances, but by his courage, his integrity, and his unwavering belief in the power of truth. He knew his mother would be proud.